This is a conversation I had with John Russell. John's a philosopher, professor emeritum at Langara College in Vancouver, British Columbia, in Canada. John's just had a wonderful career. He's been massively influential in philosophy of sport space. You can see just a sampling of articles that I've pulled here. John and I talk about a number of things across a wide spectrum, starting with baseball, a mutual passion and interest of ours, but we talk about philosophy and his path through academia and law and activism and a number of other things that he's been through, and then his career and work in philosophy of sport. Really fascinating conversation. Always enjoyed talking with John, and I hope you enjoy it too. Okay, I think we're good to go. So hey, John, thanks for agreeing to do this with me. I'm really excited about it.
Oh, my pleasure, Sam. It's nice
Yeah.
to see you and have a chance to talk about these things.
Yeah. So I sent you over a couple of questions that I wanted to talk about. So I thought it would be good form to immediately go off script and I'll ask you some hardball questions. Um, Specifically, who is the greatest pitcher of all time in your view?
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure who the greatest pitcher of all time is. So if you've read my paper about boredom in sport, um, w- it really talks about the sort of trajectory of the development of skills in sport. So it can look like people like Walter Johnson um, and other pitchers of that area, Lefty Grove and so on, even Babe Ruth, right? Have out absolutely remarkable sort of pitching careers, but of course it was in the early stages of baseball development. And if you look at their videos of them, you know, they point the way to sort of modern pitching techniques, but you know that with modern coaching, they would throw harder and they would throw
Yeah.
a different variety of pitches and so on. Um, I think what happens is when the color barrier is broken in baseball, skills just sort of take off because you now you have a larger pool of individuals.
Yeah.
You have sort of different cultures in terms of how to think of conceptualize the game and so on. So the game, in the 50s and in the 60s, I think the 60s was really a point where integration had really happened. And the two great pitchers in the United in baseball in the United States in the 60s were Koufax and Bob Gibson. And they would be on everyone's list. I think they're probably better pitchers than anybody who came before them, both of them. Koufax would be my favorite.
Well, can I pause you for just a moment? Of course, I knew you were. I was going to ask you that question, and I wrote down what I thought you would say.
Yeah, and Sandy and Bob's sort of mechanics are incredible, just absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
It's all often talked about how Koufax had these incredibly long fingers and he got more rotation on the ball and explained why he had this curveball that just like it dropped off a table, almost impossible to hit. You could know that it was coming and it would
I
be
still
impossible.
couldn't handle it. Yeah.
But
I
the other thing that Sandy had that I've never really seen to the same degree and is not discussed, and I'm not an expert, but I would like to hear it discussed, is he had an incredibly high release point because he
mm,
had such long arms, and that meant the ball was coming down
right.
fast,
Right.
right? And that's a tough thing for batters. So from my childhood, he's probably, I love the Yankees, but
Hmm.
he ate them up in the first World Series that he met them in,
Yeah.
and
I like to hear players talk about facing Gibson. The way that hitters talk about facing him, I think, is very telling of his stuff. They
yeah,
talk about it as if it's just trying to hit a shadow. It's just you can't do it,
yeah,
which I think is neat. And of course, I have to ask, what about a position player?
yeah. Oh gosh, position player. Um, there are so many of them. There really are so many of them. Um, Again, going back to the 60s, Brooks Robinson transformed
Oh
third
yeah,
base. He really did. But there are lots of people who play that well today. Um, there. and today it would be hard to choose people because what has happened in terms of skill progression is we don't have people that stand out like that, the way that
Yeah.
Robinson
Yeah.
stood out, the way that Willie Mays stood out in center field, Mays could play, I'm sure, on any major league team
Okay.
today.
Well,
But
I'm
yeah.
not doing bad. I don't know if you noticed that I covered it up. I didn't put down Brooks Robinson, but I did put Willie Mays. Uh,
I think of Mays as probably the best all-round position player. Uh, you know, um, he missed years from due to military
yeah.
service.
Yeah.
And again, if he'd had the benefit of modern coaching, who
Yeah.
knows? Who knows? And he was discouraged from hitting home runs to hit for average. And then he moved to the ballpark in the United States is probably the worst ballpark for hitting home runs in, and that would be Candlestick Park in San Francisco. It was cold there. The wind blew in. He
Yeah.
still ended up with 660 home runs. He very likely would have equaled Babe Ruth's
Yeah.
record.
It's interesting to, just being a baseball generation younger. I of course adore and loved Ken Griffey Jr. And
Hmm.
of course he's sort of an acolyte of Mays, and so to hear him talk about Mays is just gonna, like, if I had to name a position player, despite Barry Bonds' sort of marvelous performance, and it's not because of the PED thing for me. I just prefer Griffey Jr. to Bonds. And if I had to pick a pitcher, I think it'd probably be Nolan Ryan, just because he was so good for so long and
Yeah.
such a dominant, fastball pitcher.
Yeah, yeah.
Just
Oh, he's great. I live in Vancouver. We would drive down with my sons to watch Ken Griffey when he was in Seattle, and
yeah,
the stuff he did in the outfield was unbelievable.
yeah,
The catches he made off the center field wall in
yeah,
Seattle were just beyond belief. They couldn't be better, really, and so graceful.
yeah.
Just
He
really.
was a really aesthetic player, and I can remember watching him as a kid. As you just said, these drives to center field, and you think, oh, there's just no chance he'll play it off the wall, and then it's like, boy, he might get to it. And it's like, oh my gosh, he didn't get to it. He caught it.
Yeah,
It's unbelievable.
yeah.
You doubt him every step of the way, and then he makes the play. It's really incredible. So anyway, I thought I would talk a little baseball first, just because you and I share a sort of passion for baseball. You
Yeah.
more than me, maybe, but
Well, I don't know. I've really enjoyed our exchanges, brief exchanges about rules and about events on the baseball field. It's an endlessly fascinating game, in my opinion.
yeah, yeah, and the fact that players keep finding little loopholes to get through. As tight as the loopholes get, they still find loopholes, um, which is kind of fascinating and neat. So I wanted to ask. I've done a few of these now, and it's always interesting for me to hear your personal biography, your genealogy. How you became the sort of academic that you are and have been, and it'd be nice for people to hear that, I think. So if you wouldn't mind walking through that, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, it's. I think it's an interesting story. So cut me short if it stops being
Okay.
interesting.
All right.
But before I became an academic, I was a sort of a social activist, and well, I was an executive director of the probably the most influential civil liberties organization in the country, the BC Civil Liberties Association.
Hmm.
And we had a softball team that a friend of mine, a co-author of mine in philosophy of sport, Alistair Brown, and I put together called the Democratic Tigers. And it was a team of philosophers and lawyers, and we were pretty good. We weren't a bad team, but I tell you, we never lost an argument on the field. We lost. So I played outfield, and one day, I was playing right field, and a ball was hit to me, and I threw to third base for what would have been the third and final out of the last inning. We were up by 3 runs. Um, Anybody who knows baseball knows the throw from right field to third base is
Yeah.
maybe the toughest play in baseball, the most athletic play in baseball, alongside maybe some plays that, shortstop and third base make, lots of athletic plays. But it's a tough, you have to have a real arm. And I do not have a good arm. I'm what's called a Venus de Milo outfielder.
Mhm.
You get the reference, right? Venus de Milo is the statue without arms.
Mhm.
Well, so I made a throw to third base and I got the third and final out. The league was set up so that you umpired your own team, and the
Oh, I know where
the
this is going.
called woman safe. And so now the bases are loaded. Bases are loaded on what should have been a call, a force, no, a tag out at third base. Bases are loaded. The next pitch, the hitter hits the ball, not just anywhere, it hits it over my head, right? So I've been denied the best play I've ever made in my life, and now the ball is going over the head. It's a grand slam home run. We were up by 3 runs. It's four runs. We lose the game. So there was a discussion after the game with the other team. Um, and one of my philosophy friends said to me, John, you're so upset you take this too seriously. What you have you not read J.L. Austin's How to Do Things with Words? There's no fact of the matter about whether someone is out. The umpire creates the fact by his or her statement. And that made me even more angry because Austin, I knew Austin well enough to know that he thought that what are called performative utterances can be a combination of the creation of a fact, but also a statement that is either true or false. And he uses examples from sport to illustrate this, umpires' calls to illustrate the idea that, well, a judge creates a verdict when she or he says guilty, but it's also true that the guilty statement can be, although it's a fact, you are legally guilty. It's also something that could be true or false. So I wrote a paper about this, and I used a lot. I've been reading stuff about umpires, and umpires love my friend Jonathan Katz's position on this. I refuted Jonathan. The doyen of baseball umpires is a guy called Bill Clem, and he used to say when he was criticized, "Listen, it ain't anything till I call it." And another umpire, I think McKinnon was his name, said, "If you don't believe you're out, read the morning newspaper." So there's this sort of history of sort of a confusion of sort of Austinian ideas about performative utterances.
Hmm.
And so I wrote a paper about calls and called the concept of call in baseball.
Yeah.
And I didn't know, this is 1997, I didn't know that there was a journal of philosophy of sport. I just happened to type into the old Netscape search engine the words philosophy of sport, and up pops the journal. And it had been operating for basically 30 years at that time. So I sent the paper to the journal. They asked me, they published it. I got really nice reviews, very helpful reviews. And then the editor, Bill Morgan, said to me, "Why don't you write a paper about rules? You've written one about calls." And I was teaching philosophy of law at the time, and I would always use, as legal philosophers do, sport examples to illustrate different positions in
Hmm.
philosophy of law, different ideas. And so the rules paper, it are rules all an umpire have to work with,
Yeah. Yeah.
out in 1999. And I still hadn't decided. At that point, I thought, this is a lot of fun. And I gave that paper in Boston at the World Philosophy Congress, where IAPS, International Association for Philosophy of Sport, had a meeting. And this is a lot of fun. And Angela Schneider talked to me about doing more work in philosophy of sport. And a couple of years later, Bill Morgan invited me to The Ohio State University to give a paper. And at
When was that? Do you know?
that was 2002 or 2003.
Okay. Because
But
he had
at that,
invited, oh, sorry. He had invited, I was a student of his there, and he had invited Paul Gaffney in a similar circumstance.
yeah,
That's the first I encountered Paul and was really impressed.
yeah.
Anyway, so,
So I was there with a bunch of other philosophers of sport. They had paid me to come, not only my way, but paid me some money. And that's unusual.
hmm.
The other thing was I got introduced to Scott Kretschmar's graduate students and a whole bunch of other really good philosophers of sport. I got to know Bob Simon quite well. We had met in 1998, but I got to know him quite well there. And at that point, and that's where I gave my paper on dangerous sport.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it was published a couple of years later. And at that point, I decided, you know what? This is too much fun. Um, there's a rich environment here for discussion. There's lots of unturned ground. And I decided that, I'd just do philosophy of sport. At that time, I'd been publishing stuff in philosophy of law and
Yeah.
sort of
So
specialist.
did
You
you
know,
did you think about that? I think it's somewhere in Paul Weiss's book that you can write about philosophy of sport only if you have tenure. Were you post tenure at that point?
I was not post tenure. My goodness, no, I was hanging on for dear life. Actually, I had a full-time position at UBC, but not a tenure track position. And then I was offered a position at Langara. So this was sort of done off the side of my table, but because I had this sort of rich group of local friends in Vancouver, who liked to talk about sport, including Alistair Brown, but also the people on the Democratic Tigers team. The pizza after the game was as interesting as the game often.
Yeah.
And
You know, so
yeah,
so sorry to interrupt you for just a
oh,
second. So I think the first paper I published in JPS was the deception paper that I wrote, and you were the editor for that because I remember we had quite a bit of back and forth.
yeah,
But that paper, much like what you're describing, I used to work for the high school sports administration organization here in Ohio, and that was just me and a friend, sort of like you said, side at the table during breaks, having lunch,
yeah.
arguing about framing pitches and other things. And before I know it, it's a manuscript and off you go. So it's just sorry to interrupt, but it's a
No,
interesting parallel.
exactly. And for a couple of years around that time, I would set up my summer reading, I'd get to read all these sports books that were related, especially umpiring books and so on at
Yeah.
that time. And then later books about mountain climbing and so on. So it wasn't hard. And the other thing is because I wasn't tenure track um, at that point, I I was I didn't feel the pressure, I
Yeah.
think, that if
Yeah.
I was tenure track or tenured, you got to do serious philosophy. And people did take me aside. This is sort of an interesting, I think, historical sideline, sidelight, that they took me aside and says, you should do something more serious, get back to the philosophy of law stuff, do this. And I think that I thought then that was a profoundly mistaken attitude.
Hmm.
And I think I never felt any regret or guilt about pursuing this area. I think it's terrifically interesting, and I think as it has turned out, has become only more and more rich in terms of not only understanding sport, but how sport can help us to understand some other things in life. So I came to see dispositions like striving and resilience, which are fundamental to sport. You can't have sport without
Yeah.
either of those. That's sort of cardinal virtues in human lives as well. They're
Yeah.
under recognized.
I
So
I wanted to talk about that a little bit. Sorry, getting a little bit ahead in things I'd hoped to talk about. I think it was Camus said at one point, everything he learned about morality or ethics, he learned on the field or something to that effect. Similar idea. Like I'm in a teaching line, which part of what I love about that is that I don't have this pressure to publish high profile. I can do whatever I want, publish what,
mhm,
scholarship wise. So I've
mhm.
really enjoyed that. I did want to back up for a second though. So were you trained in law? I mean, you're not a JD, are you?
No, I was I did a PhD in philosophy at Cornell,
Huh.
and my supervisor there was David Lyons, who had a joint appointment with the law school there and in philosophy.
Hmm.
Lyons was quite famous for his work on utilitarianism and his work on rights and his work on legal positivism. So it was a sort of a natural move for me. I was executive director of the BC Civil Liberties Association, the Canadian
Ah, yeah.
in the 80s had just repatriated the Constitution. We had a constitutional Bill of Rights like the United States, and the courts were just starting to sort of flex their muscle, or that's not really the right word, but to recognize that they have been given this role, very like the role that had been given to the U.S. Supreme Court post the independence of the United States, as a sort of important check and balance, constitutional through Bill of Rights and separation of powers and so on. So it was a very heady time, and I thought I would spend my life doing sort of, human rights law and civil
Yeah.
liberties. And I did go back to that and became part of a Civil Liberties Association for 40 years altogether. And we took the case in Canada that resulted in recognition of euthanasia as a sort of fundamental constitutional right. So we did lots of really important work, but by the time the 90s, mid 90s, maybe early 2000s rolled around, it was intense, and this was such a nice, and I was trained for it as well. Everything I had learned in sort of graduate school, and a lot of the stuff that I had learned from sort of social activists and playing with the Democratic Tigers,
Hmm.
experiences there, just sort of made it a really happy coincidence of fits that I don't regret at all, and I love the relationships I've sort of struck up, and tried to be a productive contributor.
Yeah. I can't help but I can't resist commenting on the team name, the Democratic Tigers. Tigers strike me as anything but democratic. They seem to sort of be quite autocratic as far as wild animals go. Do whatever the hell they want.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll tell you the story behind that is not that interesting. Alistair and I both loved the Detroit Tigers
Oh,
cap. And so became the Democratic Tigers for that reason.
I
Uh,
see. All right.
not because of it was a, not was because it was a sort of a defense of rugged individualism. We did have a libertarian team in our league at one point, we knew the people on it quite well. Some of the members were members of the Civil Liberties Board. It was a very diverse board. They called themselves, appropriately enough, the right fielders.
That's clever. That's good.
There was nothing clever about it. We liked the hat. We wanted to use the hat. And Detroit Tigers became the Democratic Tigers because it was sort of a team that was associated with the BC Civil Liberties
Yeah.
Association.
Well, and there has to be room in the league for the Monarchs, I suppose. That would make a nice hat too. Put the butterfly on the cap.
I coached in Vancouver. I coached the Monarchs was our name for a number of years, and
Hmm.
that was a reflection of in part of my love of Negro League baseball.
Yeah. So, okay, so you mentioned sort of training with a utilitarian, the path that takes you through the law, and the interest in the law, but then you also mentioned some of your work on resilience and
Striving.
striving. And I mean, if someone asked me to describe you, I would describe you as a virtue theorist. Maybe that's incorrect. Maybe you're just a sort of philosopher who knows virtue theory. But maybe we could jump ahead and talk about that a little bit. Maybe just share your thoughts about resilience and striving and maybe what you think are other cardinal virtues of sport and life.
So, yeah, um, I never really thought of myself as a virtue theorist, but a colleague of mine at Langara, where I spent most of my academic career, departed sadly departed,
Hmm.
died too young. Bunnell Strickling was a virtue theorist, and we shared an office, and she kept pushing me her syllabi and these books and so on. I'd read them. So that's how we're talking about late 90s, early 2000s. That's where I sort of um, developed a more sophisticated sense of it, and it made sense to my students. So I started teaching it, and I was certainly well educated at Cornell, but Terry Irwin and then others about virtue theory. So I had a nice
Terry
background in
Terry Irwin, as in Terrence Irwin?
Terrence Irwin. Yeah,
Yeah.
Terrence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was on my thesis committee as well. But so I did have this background,
Sorry,
but I
sorry,
think
John. To interrupt again. I knew
you go.
it's
Yeah,
just it's just sitting right. It just happens to be right
yeah.
behind my computer.
Yeah,
I thought,
don't think that.
yeah,
I'm
okay.
not sure. The most recent edition of Terry. Terry's redone the Nicomachean Ethics a few times, and is brilliant. And we never ever once talked about sport. Like I'm not sure.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm not sure. Terry would know first base from a fork. Um, anyway,
Yeah,
it's
sorry, I took you off track there.
no, that's fine. That's fine. So about virtue theory, I never thought of myself as a virtue theorist, you know. But I think what happened was that sport pressed me in that direction because I think sport reflects sort of fundamental ideas about virtue, and and those ideas are also reflected outside of sport. And so it was a combination of things. Again, it was sort of lucky that I had a colleague who we talked to a lot about virtue theory, and I learned a lot from. But the other thing is that sport is just sort of a rich ground for it. Randy Fiesel wrote a lovely book with a co-author whose name I'm going to forget about character in sport that was sort of about
Oh
uh,
yeah, that's on my bookshelf. Yeah.
yeah. So, for me, philosophical hero is probably Aristotle. It's not just virtue theory, it's a whole bunch of things, metaphysics and so on. But it is interesting, right? You got in that period of philosophical history in three generations, Socrates says no one can define virtue, right? Plato takes it as a bit of a challenge and tries to make some progress there. Within a space of about 40 years, Aristotle develops a virtue theory that is intended as an answer to Socrates that virtue cannot be defined. And Aristotle's account of virtue is the point of departure for discussions about virtue today, well over
Yeah.
2,000 years later.
So I want to talk about your resilience paper. I think it was actually a Canadian, maybe a rugby player or a hockey player who I heard describe wisdom recently, and I hadn't heard it before. Maybe you'll appreciate this. I think his description of wisdom was he said knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, and wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you hear that one?
I've heard that one before. I'm not sure, but I think tomatoes can go in some fruit salads.
So to talk about your resilience paper for just a minute, I reread it last week to sort of freshen up for this. So you put resilience as the midpoint between abjurance, I think. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I mean, in traditional virtue theory, from Aristotle, we see virtues as sitting between as a mean, not an arithmetical mean, but a disposition that is expressed in
Right.
action. So it's just sort of a psychological state. It's a disposition that exists when it's expressed in action between a vice of excess or deficiency, right? And so classic virtue would be like bravery, and an excessive bravery would be a vice. It wouldn't be being brave.
That'd be
It would
foolhardy.
be hardiness, right?
Yeah.
Or be rash. And then an absence of it would be cowardice. And so what's nice about resilience, and what no one had noticed before, was that resilience also appears to be a virtue. It's concerned with choice. You have to make choices. You face adversity. You face some setback, and you have to try to hit a mean. So too much resilience is sort of obduracy or inflexibility or bullheadedness,
Yeah.
and not enough would be sort of defeatism. So to put
Oh,
this in
that's
the
right. I couldn't remember what you'd put on
yeah.
that on the
So,
side.
we all know people who've tried golf or any sport, right? And if they can't do it really well right away, they give up. That's a sort of defeatist attitude. But we also know more tragically of people whose resilience motive
Excessive. Yeah.
is excessive, and maybe they're just inflexible or obdurate or bullheaded. They beat their head literally against a wall to their own detriment. But lots of tragic examples of that in sport. And probably the one I talk about in my paper is Muhammad Ali,
Yeah.
striving for a fourth heavyweight champion title and probably destroying himself substantially in the process.
Yeah. It's interesting as a parent, I have two at this point in my life, two early teenagers, and one of them is a bit abdurant. She just won't back down from anything ever. And
Yeah,
I'm at the other end, and it's very difficult to sort of try to parent or coach those virtues and hit the midpoint. It's
yeah.
a real challenge,
Well,
I
it's
think.
it's harder, and this sort of talks a little bit about the dangerous sports stuff. It's harder for kids, right? Because they are, I think of childhood as a sort of a time of self-affirmation par excellence, right?
Yeah.
Your life is really about pushing boundaries and finding what your boundaries are, and a little bit of what looks like bullheadedness or inflexibility in say practicing the piano, which I think your daughter does and
Yeah.
plays
Yeah.
beautifully, right? Is something, you never really find out your limit until you really, really try hard and you take setbacks, which is about resilience, right? So striving and resilience, you take setbacks, maybe you really, you didn't perform a piece as well as you would have liked to, or you didn't learn it as fast, or you didn't learn it the way you wanted. Those are all setbacks. You want to be able to play something at a certain metronome marking, and you just haven't been able to do it. Well, it can look like bullheadedness. And it might be that there are better strategies, right, than
Mm.
just simply, trying your hardest. I think oftentimes what kids and strivers don't realize is that sometimes you have to strive less
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah. That was an interesting comment in your paper. I remember that.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I think all that stuff connects really nicely to Aristotle, and it's what you can't have sport without striving, right? If there's
Yeah.
no effort involved, and if you don't have the prospect of a setback, Bob Simon has this lovely example of we wouldn't think of it as an interesting match. Nobody, no, a 7 foot basketball player
Yeah.
wouldn't take on a team of 5-year-olds, right? There's no striving, there are not going to be any setbacks, likely, and so on. So these are fundamental to sport. You don't have them without sport. And Aristotle lacked the terminology of resilience. There's no Greek
Yeah.
word, resilience.
So I wanted to ask you about that. Again, sorry to interrupt. In
Yeah,
that paper, you have a footnote. I always worry what I miss in the footnotes. So I always go to read the footnotes, you know. You have a footnote about where I think you even quote Aristotle when he says something to the effect of nameless virtues.
yeah,
And it wasn't clear to me whether he meant unknown virtues or virtues that are recognized but don't have a name.
yeah.
There is a subtle difference there.
There's a big difference, and it's
Yeah.
an important difference. And so Aristotle says, look, there are virtues that we don't have names for, but they're expressed in action, and there
Yeah.
are also vices. And so, it's not surprising in a way that, we have a vice, um, for a deficiency of resilience, sort of defeatism or something like that. But it's not surprising that we have that name, but it's unsurprising that in a way that we don't have a name or any really clearly good name for being overly resilient, right? Being
Yeah.
bullheaded but it's not the best word for it. I'm not sure obduracy. It's not just about being
Yeah.
inflexible. It's about being.
I thought about stubborn, but that's not quite right either. I mean, it is hard to put a name on that.
Yeah, it's hard. But if you once you start to do some virtue theory stuff, you start to recognize that, virtues just sort of appear around you everywhere, and you wonder what the name is. And
Hmm.
but often, very often, it's the vices that we don't have any clear name for, and it's different in different languages,
Yeah,
too.
that's I think about that too. I was raised speaking English. I only speak English. I think in English. And it's fun for me to speak and engage with non-English natives because, like I have a good friend who tells me, I think in Spanish, I speak in English. And sometimes they're not compatible. There's no analog. And that's hard for him sometimes. So you said something a minute ago that I think might be worth remembering. For the longest time, I taught in an undergraduate class. I teach an ethics and sport class, and I taught the second iteration of your dangerous sport paper, the one on children in dangerous sport. And I taught both of them, but that one in particular. And I think one of the more overlooked lines or points that you make in that paper was about time limited opportunities for kids.
Yeah.
And so I have this example that I would use. I had a friend in school. I grew up playing American football and baseball predominantly and other sports too. But I had a friend who was a big kid. He's a big, tall kid, strong, big frame, looks like a football player. And his parents would never let him play. And as we got out of high school and we were a bit older in our mid 20s, he'd say things to me like, I wish I could have played. I wish I would have played. And at one point I sort of turned to him and I said, play now. And of course, the joke, of course, is you can't. It's too late. There are certain windows that sort of tragically close early, and doing dangerous stuff as a kid is one of those things that strikes many people as counterintuitive.
It's
But I,
not it's not it's not unique to dangerous sport either, right? I mean, if you want to become an accomplished pianist,
yeah,
you got to start young. You can be you can be a good pianist, but if you really want to become a really proficient pianist, it's hard to do after you reach about 15 years old.
yeah. And I wonder how much of that, it'd be fun to go over to the psychology department and talk to people about learning, and because we know the same is true for language acquisition, right? As young kids, you pick it up virtually instantaneously, and then in older life, it's requires a great deal of work and effort to do that.
So in all those cases, it poses moral dilemmas, right? So
Yeah,
in it's more pressing in the context of dangerous sport because the consequences, if we think of dangerous sport as something that presents a genuine prospect that you'll lose some capacity for human functioning temporarily or maybe permanently, right?
yeah,
And so it's more pressing in that context, but in all contexts, I think where children are developing talents, you know, they're they're developing some talents often at the expense of having other opportunities and doing other things, especially if they become serious about them and really want to do them. And so, the idea of an open future for children, which is Feinberg's idea,
yeah,
something has to be very carefully qualified because, to develop basic virtues, often we have to specialize, I think. And for children, that means, if I'm raised in a family of singers and musicians, it's unlikely I'm going to become a proficient soccer player, or maybe,
yeah,
or it may be the case that I'm not going to, I couldn't have a career as a classical scholar.
yeah.
Yeah.
Nick Dixon has a nice line in his paper about Feinberg where he says to open one door is inescapably to close another.
Mm.
I like the way he put that.
Yeah, it's probably an exaggeration, but it's on the path,
Yeah.
it's on the path to being true. And we have a colleague, Patrick Findler, who's
Yeah.
written about dangerous sport and written some lovely articles about football and head injuries and so on. He's actually going to, I think he's now on his way to putting together a special issue for the Journal of Philosophy of Sport, not this
Oh,
year, but on dangerous sport. If
yeah, that,
people,
that could be interesting. Speaking
yeah,
of that, and going off script, which I mentioned earlier, I'd be remiss not to mention that JPS, has an issue dedicated to John Russell. Um, that must that must be feel like quite an honor, and it must be an odd feeling. How do you feel about that?
well, it is an honor. It
Yeah.
really is an honor. And I've seen most of the papers now. I'm in the midst of responding, thinking about responses to some of them. People are being very kind. I'm humbled by it, truly humbled by it. I think I understand, I'm not sure that I'm not sure that my stuff is so groundbreaking, but I think I understand, I have sort of pushed some boundaries that haven't, or turned over ground that hasn't really had a lot of work. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit more and clarify because some of the work I've done. I still have to sort of pinch myself, feel a little bit of
Hmm.
imposter syndrome about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Did this with Bill Morgan too, almost in parallels and time wise, and when the issue came out for him, and he sort of said the same thing of, all this time I didn't think anybody was listening or paying attention to me, which he knows that's not true, of course, and I'm sure you know that too. But yeah, it's a well-deserved honor, I think.
Thank you for saying that. I learned so much from my colleagues. I think of uh, in philosophy of sport. I think of my work as really, it none of it could have come out the way it did without the help the people I attend conferences with, and Bill
Yeah.
Morgan's an example. 5-minute conversation with Bill. Even though Bill and I disagree on some things, most things actually I think we're pretty close. But we have some sharp disagreements on some things. But Bill is just an incredibly a great example as a critic, and a great example for others. And 5 minutes discussion with Bill puts me further ahead on any topic I want to address. So
Yeah.
find those people, right? Find those people who you can talk to, and who make sense to you, and hold them close.
Yeah. You mentioned Bob Simon earlier, and that's a big regret that I have is I never I think I met Bob a couple times before he passed, but never really had a deeper, relationship or conversation with him. I wonder if you could say a little bit about Bob. I'm sure he's one of those people for you.
Yeah, so when I wrote my paper about rules, I was not really connected into the philosophy of sport group. I had met people like Bob and Bill and Angela Schneider, and liked them a lot. Nick Dixon was another one. And then to my complete surprise, a year later, Bob writes this what you asked me what are some of the seminal papers that I would recommend. Well, one of the key ones would be Bob's internal values, and what is it?
Oh,
Internalism and internal values in
yep,
sport.
yep.
APS, I think 2000, pretty. So that's a year after my rules paper. And in that paper, he talks about my work and other people's work, but really he takes on the sort of Dworkinian, Ronald Dworkin philosopher of law
Yep.
approach to sport, and says, this makes sense of how we should think about sport. It's not merely a rules-oriented institution. There are values here, and they're the sorts of values that Russell talks about and that other people had talked about too. But I put it specifically in that context. Sport is more than just rules. There are values there, and umpires use those values, and game rights use those values. Coaches do, players do, and so we're talking about how that got reflected. So Bob wrote that paper. Didn't talk to me about that paper. Later on, he would have, because we would have been closer. And so we developed a sort of close relationship around that. And Bob, again, another Bob and Bill and Scott Kretschmar and Angela are three wonderful examples of, if you want to talk to somebody about their work and get a thoughtful, in a way, non-judgmental, encouraging,
Yeah.
constructive criticism, you could not find four better people than those individuals. And I think they really set the stage for me and made me really feel comfortable being part of the group. And I hope that I've carried on that example to some extent. That
But
that would make that would make me as proud as anything if people felt that I had been useful in the way that those four had been useful to me.
as you list those names, and I think about my relationship to those people, which is mostly through reading and less through knowing, although I do know all those people with the exception of Bob because he's passed. What you all have in common is that you write very clearly, with the exception, and I hope he doesn't take umbrage with me saying this, with the exception of Bill. Bill can be um, difficult as a writer, sometimes more difficult than others. Um, but
Well,
it's all very clear. If you work through him, he's not difficult.
no, I agree completely. Bill is a good writer. He's a different approach, I think, than others.
Yeah.
He's got one of these people who's got so much he wants to say, and so often the articles run long. I think some of mine do too. I think the resilience article would have been better if it was 1,000 or 2,000 words shorter. But
Well, that was a keynote too, though. So you had to sort of,
Yeah, I felt an obligation there. I had such good comments, and that's another thing about this discipline. People are so thoughtful and so generous. I had such good comments. I didn't want to leave anybody out.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so,
Did you ever get a chance to read Angela Schneider's book on gene technology and gene editing?
I had Angela here at a conference in Vancouver. 15 years ago or so, where she gave sort of a précis of that paper, and it was included in the volume. And so
Yeah.
I know her line. I look at her book, but I didn't study it. But I did study that lovely paper, and
Yeah.
I urge people to have a careful look at it
Well,
because I think it's relevant
the
today.
book was terrific. It's one of the, I mean, it's not very long. I think I read it on a flight actually. But it's just terrific. And it's
It's an
really,
ex Yeah, it's an
what,
extension of what she did at Langara.
yeah, it sounds like it. And what I think is really, really, what I really like about that sort of more abstractly is her ability. I think she co-authored that. So I should
Yes,
I
yes.
can't remember her.
BBC, whose name I'm going to forget
I know
now.
I feel bad about that. But what I love about it is it's empirically grounded and then philosophically reflexive. You know, she's talking about the sort of real hardcore science behind gene technology, gene editing, doping, and then what that all means, which I'm always a fan of that sort of empirical grounding. I think that's important.
Yeah, I think philosophers very often they think they're talking about philosophical topics when they really are when it really are sort of empirical assumptions,
Yeah,
sort of not hiding very far beneath the surface. And so I think you're right. It's crucial in every area where, especially where you're talking about values, to be looking at the social facts and the biological facts, other facts that are relevant in that context. Yeah.
yeah. Well, so maybe just to transition just a little bit, and you've kind of hinted at this already, so I don't want to ask you to repeat yourself. But I had asked you maybe in that the little Google document that I sent over about what you think, you know, if if someone's sort of arriving to philosophy of sport or interested in it, they certainly should read, it almost goes without saying you should read Suits because of the influence that sort of permeates so much of what happens. Um, but articles you might recommend, books you might recommend, I'd be curious to hear what you say.
Yeah, it's a very long list, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're new to philosophy of sport, and you think you might be interested in it, you should start with Bob's paper that we just talked about,
Mm.
broad interest and values in sport. I think that's a necessary part of your education. Um, other, the other pay, so you don't want to overwhelm people with a dozen or so essays, right? So that's one. The other one, again, I would go with Suits and I would look at the elements of sport. And although a lot of parts of that have been superseded and Suits later disavowed some parts of it,
Right.
it's still an influential, important paper, and it set the landscape for sport. Um, uh, um, I could be immodest here.
Do it.
Well, you know, what I thought was lacking, what I came to see was lacking sort of about 10 or 12 years ago, maybe a little longer, was that all of us, myself included, had sort of reflected on sort of the moral underpinnings of sport and the Aristotelian underpinnings of sport. So in a 2003 paper of mine, A Moral Realism of Sport, I talk about the sort of two underlying sort of moral or normative principles in sport, a sort of an Aristotelian perfectionist principle and a Kantian principle of autonomy. And that fits really quite nicely with Suits's ideas about, sports being games and the voluntary pursuit of unnecessary obstacles. You get autonomy in there, plus playing games. You get autonomy plus a pursuit of excellence, right? Overcoming obstacles. Um, but but I think that we overlook the richness of sport if we think of it too narrowly in terms of sort of Kantian for just to use shorthand Kantian and Aristotelian terms. And I started to think about cheating in sport, and I started to think about just how people and I was coaching too, and I was watching all these shenanigans happening on the field, where people would bend rules, and I caught myself teaching pitchers, right, how to avoid getting called up for a balk on a move to first base
Yeah.
if you're There's different strategies if you're a right-handed pitcher, and we call them balk moves. You are trying to deceive umpires, right?
Right.
So what room is there for that in a sport that is sort of if you think of it in terms of Kantian values and Aristotelian values, honesty and all this stuff. And so and I happened to read a lovely book by John Morial about humor, and this really speaks badly of me because I should have realized this. Two books, two key books, and I think both of these would be good as background for people. So Morial talks about humor as play and as sort of teasing play. And it has a sort of it is sort of morally borderline in a lot of circumstances, right? If you think of there's no humor without Schadenfreude. We're laughing at other people's misadventures
Yeah,
and
or our own.
yeah, um, and then Brian Sutton Smith wrote a wonderful book, which I would recommend I think everybody in philosophy of sport should read Sutton's book on play. It's called The Ambiguity of Play, and without question.
I don't think I know that at all. I haven't heard that reference.
Without question of a doubt, he's the most influential play theorist since the Second World War, which is to say he's the most influential play theorist in sociology and psychology of play. And he's done a rich empirical work and has a huge following in terms of graduate students and so his book, The Ambiguity of Play, which is right here,
Yeah, I'll have to look this up.
is also philosophically thoughtful. Unfortunately, it's not well known because the philosophy happens in the last chapter, and it's brilliant.
Hmm.
So if you do read this book, read the first chapter and the last chapter and skim through the stuff in the middle, which is all the empirical. Here we're talking about your point about the empirical stuff. So
Yeah.
the empirical evidence around play and so on. And a dominant feature of play that permeates many of the contexts in which it exists is that it's subversive and challenging to authority and challenging to perfection and challenging to morality without overcoming without passing a boundary where it is just frankly immoral. Everybody, the way we put it is everybody knows play can go too far.
Yeah.
Uh, um, and and so I started to think about this, and someone, I think it might have been Nell Strickling again, recommended that I read, and Bill said it too. You should read Susan Wolf's Moral Saints, which is an article about how we'd be so much worse off
Yeah.
if we were all moral saints.
Yeah, I read that in graduate school. That's a good one.
Yeah, and she's right. It would be boring. And so sport is not boring in part because it has this subversive element in play in many contexts,
Yeah.
right? So think of your daughter's piano recitals and so on, right? It would be awful if people were for who were the proponents of the other, the relatives of the other competitors screaming at her while she was playing to get her to screw up, right?
Right.
Well, sort of an accepted part of competitive sport that I think makes it more interesting because sport, well, for a whole bunch of reasons um, it made sport more. It would be intolerable, I think, in the context of playing
Yeah.
class.
Nick Dixon again comes to mind with his trash talking papers about, when is it appropriate to do that and when not.
Yeah, so there's a boundary. So
Yeah.
the boundary I talk about it, I think we can talk about competitive shenanigans, um, appropriate for some sports. They're less, but there's even trash talking in golf, right? No, nobody. I mean, it's really bad form if you are, making noise in your pocket,
In the backswing.
change
Yeah.
that's beyond the pale. But there's a bit of trash talking even in golf. In curling,
Hmm.
there's very little, right?
Yeah.
And interestingly, both of those sports are self-officiated. So, but most sports have this sort of wonderful sense of play in it that is not just about playing the game and playing it, appropriately and according to the rules and so on, but you're allowed to bend the rules. You're allowed to take some liberties up to a limit, and everybody, I think everybody well, maybe not everybody, but we enjoy those things about sport. My favorite example is Scottie Pippen, and I talk about this in a couple of my papers. Scottie Pippen in on the Chicago Bulls playing the Utah Jazz in the first game of the championship series, and they're down 1 point, and Karl Malone, whose nickname is the Mailman,
Yeah.
is stepping up to the line to throw a field three throw, and there's just like a couple of seconds left, right? So if he sinks these two free throws, they go 1 point ahead of. No, it's the other way around. I think the Bulls were ahead by one.
So he
Let me
needs the
get.
two free throws to take the lead.
And I think it's two free throws. Yes, two free throws. No, the Bulls were ahead by a point. No, Bulls were behind by a point. They were behind by a point. So if he sinks the two free throws, it's basically game over, right?
Ah, okay.
Right. So that's the situation. So they fouled Malone. He's going to the free throw line. The 2 points will seal the game because they're already up by a point. Scottie Pippen says to Malone, whose nickname is the Mailman, and it happened to be a Sunday,
Yeah.
is to Malone, guess what, Carl, the mailman doesn't deliver on Sunday. You
Right.
know, now Malone missed both free throws. Jordan rebounded the second free throw, made a 2 point shot, put them ahead by 1 point, and they won the game, right? So, if now, that sort of shenanigan couldn't happen, a parallel of that couldn't happen, shouldn't happen in a classical recital
Right.
comp,
Right.
right? But there's a charm about it in the context of sport. And I'm not sure I have a really good answer as to why that, except that we do accept play, having this role in our culture. Friend of mine loves to send me, he's a criminologist, loves to send me cartoons that lampoon philosophers, right? You
Hmm.
know, Sticking the needle in, but
Yeah.
it's natured fun. But
Yeah.
it's meant to hurt a little bit, right?
There has to be, yeah, there has to be a sting. I wonder if just kind of listening to you describe that, the spontaneity of play is a big part of it because so much can happen that is unexpected. And that's also sort of the secret recipe of good humor is my wife and I often call it, we call it word tennis. The shot that you get back from the other party, it's a word or a concept or an idea that permeates your head and takes you in a direction you didn't expect to go. And that's sort of what makes you go, oh, isn't that funny? Isn't that clever? Isn't that neat?
Thank you so much for that. That seems to me to be exactly right. So, what lifts that up with the Pippen Malone exchanges, it's fun, right? It's a
Yeah,
joke, it's humor. And but you can't do that you'd spoil the aesthetic effect of a piano recital if you did
by
it in
doing
that.
that. Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, John. I do want to ask maybe one more question and then I'll let you enjoy the rest of your evening. I always like to ask people about something philosophically that they have changed their mind about when they sort of look back and with the benefit of time and think, perhaps I was wrong about that. Do you have anything like that?
I have a couple. So you did send me some lovely questions to think about, and that was one of them. And so the point about play and the subversive aspects of play and how it can make sport more fun, right, is something that hadn't really occurred to me until I was sort of at least 10 years into my journey in philosophy of sport. If you'd asked me in the year 2000, what are the basic principles of sport? I did give the sort of Aristotelian Kantian sort of account. And I defended it, in a discussion of Bob's paper on broad internalism in a collection that Bill put together. But so I changed my view to think of sport as more complicated, and so that was a change. And then the other thing is that so I think in a way I was probably too serious about these things, and the stuff on play got me to lighten up a little bit. And related to that was, I think we're all type A's, right? A lot of us, you included, are, pretty accomplished amateur sports people. We teach sport. It's about striving. It's about pursuit of excellence and so on. But when I wrote my paper on striving, I have very dear friend who's a nurse who kept telling me, John, striving is not everything. And I did change my paper in response to her thoughtful and sharp criticisms. Um, Not a trained philosopher, but she made exactly the right points. And so I began to think a little bit about idleness and the importance of idleness to
Yeah.
human being. So that was a sort of a psychological change for me. And very dear friend of mine, Alistair Brown, who we've collaborated, we collaborated on a whole bunch of things. We wrote a biomedical ethics text and wrote a paper on performance enhancing drugs. Alistair used to always say to me, John, you need to take more time off. So you need to have more fun, he would say. So I think, so much of philosophy I unfortunately starts in autobiography and the goal of philosophy I think really ought to be in some ways to transcend autobiography.
Mm.
And I hope I've transcended autobiography in some sense by I see that my acknowledgement of the role of play and thinking about idleness as not a virtue, but as a really important part of a well-lived life.
Yeah.
Those were things I'm not sure I would have been so sympathetic to, 15 or 25 years ago for sure. So those are
Yeah.
changes, and
Yeah. Idleness maybe as a moderating force for striving to sort of in case you are sort of overstrident. Yeah,
yeah,
interestingly, maybe it was you that recommended it. I acquired that book in Praise of Idleness, and it's on my bookshelf. And I every time I look at it, I think I don't have time to read that because I'm too busy. Not being,
The other Russell, Bertrand Russell's
yeah,
In Praise of Violence is just a short essay, and
yeah,
it's very good. But what we didn't have until very recently was an attempt to define idleness and defend it as a value. And that was in a lovely book by Brian O'Connor called, I think it's called The Philosophy of Idleness. And so that was another important, when Judy started to talk to me about, well, striving. I don't want my kids to spend their lives just dominated by striving, she
mm,
said. I think she's right about it. You're sort of expressing this concern about your daughter maybe being too serious too. So there is a sort of a balance. There is a sort of a balance there.
yeah. Well, John, I really appreciate it. I always enjoy talking to you. I'm really glad we could line this up and set aside the time for it. So just want to thank you again for that. As always, I enjoyed talking with you. This is probably the longest the two of us have had a sustained conversation because we're normally at a conference and people are kind of vying for a few minutes
Yeah,
with each other. So
yeah,
it's nice.
and yeah, it's nice. I hope we get to do it again sometime. Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay. Take care, John. We'll see you soon.